Welcome back. Now, the past few months have been hard for consumers. Putting food on the table is becoming difficult, with food prices rising significantly. This while salaries remain the same or people are losing jobs. To discuss what can be done to survive and how dire the situation is, I'm joined by Mervyn Abrams from the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group and economist Chris Gilmore, coming to us live all the way from the UK. Thank you both so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Let's start with you, Mervyn. I want to speak about how dire the situation is, because we know that food prices have gone up significantly, and it seems as though people's salaries are staying the same or people are losing jobs. Perhaps just your perspective on how dire the situation is.
Yes, so good evening, Heidi, and good evening to all your viewers. Yes, the situation in South Africa at the moment is that the ordinary consumer is under immense financial pressure due to massive increases in fuel and energy costs. Electricity prices have increased. The knock-on effect of both global and local factors have led to massive increases in food prices. When we look at our household affordability index for the month of June, the 44 very basic foods that low-income households tend to purchase at the end of each month now stands at 4,688 Rand. That is a 78 Rand increase on the previous month and a 560 or a 13% increase over the past year. And of course, all these increases are happening at a time when interest rates are also on the increase, making debt costs even more expensive, leaving less money in the pockets for households to be able to pay for the essential services like transport, like food, etc.
I think what's very alarming is the fact that year on year this basket is up by over 560 Rand. That is a lot of money for someone that doesn't have that extra bit of cash. Chris Gilmore, let's bring you in here. We had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about the July unrest, and you were speaking about how food inflation is a real issue, and this could possibly be the next trigger for any kind of unrest or instability that we see in the country, because people are just not surviving.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of things. First of all, The Economist magazine has got a model which they've been developing over the years that shows a very close correlation between food inflation and social unrest. So in other words, the higher food inflation goes, the greater the chance of social unrest in all countries around the world, not just South Africa. So that's worrying. Then I think if you look at the reaction of all governments around the world over many hundreds of years, going back to the French Revolution, you had people like Marie Antoinette in a very kind of very high-handed manner saying that the peasants were revolting because there's no bread. And she said, let them eat cake. Well, we know what happened to her. She got the chop, literally. But, I think that just shows you the kind of level of emotion that is characterized when it comes to food. I can remember 20-odd years ago in Zimbabwe, the food riots took place there. When people reach the point where food becomes unaffordable, then I think a lot of them feel that they've got nothing to lose but their chains, and they go on the rampage. And that's when governments, bring in the big guns, literally and figuratively. So I think we're sitting at this point in time in a very uneasy situation around the world. If you look at the FAO index as a proxy for food prices around the world, it's come off a bit in the past two or three months, but from record highs. I mean, we're still looking at 23-24% higher than they were a year ago. But nevertheless, it's still very, very high, and we've reached a perfect storm. Many countries have banned exports of cereals, particularly because they've had poor crops, flooding, drought, this type of thing. And then the straw that has broken the camel's back has been the war in Ukraine. In many instances, they're not able to get that food out, those cereals out, the grain, the wheat, from the silos there. And much of that could rot, literally, in the silos if nothing happens fairly quickly. So we're all reaching a fairly pretty much a perfect storm. And as Mervyn says, it's all happening at a time when inflation and interest rates are rising. We have the MPC meeting next week, and we're likely to see another 50 basis point increase in that. So it's just going to make life even tougher.
It really does seem as though things are only going to get worse. I'm not sure where exactly these statistics come from. I think it's the Household Affordability Index, where cooking oil has increased by 69%. Spinach has increased by 39%. And these are basics that we're looking at. Cake flour has increased by 24%, chicken livers by 24%. For example, cabbage by 22%. And Mervyn, maybe you can come in here to speak about how absolutely everything is going up. You know, before it would be, okay, the fuel price is going up, or the price of meat is going up, and people could find a way to do away with those things or not be so dependent on those things. But it seems now as though everybody literally has to count their senses, walk into a shop and say, what can I actually afford in here, because everything has gone up. I mean, I can't get over the cooking oil going up by almost 69%.
Yes, Heidi, and that actually is our index. That's the index we put out every month. So those figures reflect really what we are finding in the stores across 4 or 5 of our main cities. Heidi, it is, as Chris had said, it is a perfect storm. So there's an intercorrelation between all these factors. When fuel prices increase, so does fertilizer prices. And when fertilizer prices increase, of course, it has a direct impact on the food that is grown on the farm. So spinach would go up because fuel prices have gone up, and other foods like butternut and tomatoes and etc. So there is a correlation between all these various things, the input cost, etc. So what we are saying is that actually the consumer is under such immense pressure that it's now incumbent on government to begin to step in and to say in which way can we actually support particularly the low-income sector of our population. Because if we think about it, the national minimum wage is currently at about something like 3,600 Rand. And the basket of basic food is now costing 4,600. So even if you spend your entire salary on food, which of course we cannot, because there's also transport, there's also electricity, etc., then it is just absolutely impossible. And so what actually happens is that households tell us that they have to prioritize transport costs because workers must get to work in order to bring the wage in. They also have to prioritize electricity for security reasons, but also for cooking purposes. And only then, and of course then debt servicing, and only then do they purchase food. So what happens is, with all these other costs increase, it leaves less money in the food budget. And then when you get to the store, then you've seen an increase of about 13% over the past year. So this is really what is going to lead to increased hunger in South Africa.
We'll get into the aspect of food security in just a moment. But Mr. Gilmore, maybe we can ask you about the role that government can play, if at all, in this crisis at the moment, because South Africans are just not making ends meet, and the predictions are that things are only going to get worse, not only because of global factors at play, but because nothing is getting better at this stage. What do you think is the role of governments, if at all, to try and soften the blow and the pressure for consumers?
Well, Heidi, as I said right at the beginning, it's in government's interest to try and keep people literally off the streets. What they physically do, and again, Mervyn is probably better placed than I am to give you a view on this. I'm really just not sure now. You can have food subsidies, for example, but these pretty quickly run out. I mean, the scale of the problem is such that if you start having large-scale food subsidies, they're not going to last very long. And the problem is that these the food inflation, as far as I can see, is going to last for quite some time. This isn't an overnight sensation. This is going to last for months and maybe even years. So if you have some kind of food subsidy, you're going to have this built in to the system for a long, long time, and that takes an awful lot of money. So your question is it worth it to keep people literally off the streets? The answer is probably yes.
Mervyn, perhaps just your last thoughts on a way forward. I always try and say I don't want my interviews to just be doom and gloom. Maybe tips for consumers. I know we are in a doom and gloom stage, but I just try and find the positive wherever it might be. But just any tips for consumers. I mean, we're all really struggling, and it doesn't seem as though it's going to get any better, and there's concerns about a food security crisis. So how do we avoid all of that if we can at all?
So yes, it is extremely difficult for consumers, but really what we have to do is to turn around, as my parents used to say, each rand before you spend it. There are a few things that consumers can do. So the first thing is write your shopping list at home and stick to that when you get into the store. So you're not tempted to buy something that you don't actually need. So that could be one thing. Another could be a number of the retail stores are selling combos at the moment. You know, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, etc. And often these are, if you're a household of 4, it's actually too much for you. So what we are suggesting is that, you know, you club together with a family or a friend or a next door neighbor, buy a combo together, share it out, and perhaps buy 2 combos so that you don't have any food being wasted. So that's another thing to do. Of course, be very careful as to when you have to take a trip. Don't use your car unless it's absolutely essential. Try to use public transport because it's still cheaper than going with your own car, etc. But we have to find ways and means and to get through. But really, the state will have to also step in, particularly around providing a support to the low-income households. And the instrument they can use is, of course, to expand the social grant of relief to more people than are currently registered for that grant.
And I don't want to end this interview off on a negative, but Mr. Gilmore, perhaps just your last views and comments. Do you think things will get any better, or do you think that government has completely lost control of the situation and they have perhaps other things to deal with at this stage, and you know, food inflation isn't really a huge concern for them when it should be? But I'm just asking what your views are with regards to this.
No, I think as the year drags on, food inflation will come to the fore, and I think government will understand exquisitely that this really is a huge issue, and they're really going to have to come to the party. But really, just to end off on perhaps a positive note, what people can do is grow more of their own. I mean, what you've had over many decades in parts of London, for example, and you've had working class people having things called allotments, where you have little patches of ground, and they go in there and they grow their own vegetables, and actually quite successfully. Now, in a country like South Africa, where if you drop something on the ground, it just about starts growing. It's incredibly fertile ground. You'd be amazed what you can do with just a little bit of guidance, you know, a little bit of seed, and you can do an awful lot.
Certainly. I think that spinach and cabbage that's gone up by 39% and 22%. Even butternut has gone up by 21%. You could perhaps just plant some of your own and it could make some kind of difference. And Mervyn was speaking about using public transport. Public transport in this country is very unreliable at this stage, but perhaps you could walk and burn some of those calories. So there are ways around it. But thank you both so much for your time. We do appreciate it. That was Mervyn Abrams from the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Social Group, as well as and Dignity Group, rather, sorry, and economist Chris Gilmore.